My name is Hans Hamrán. I'm sitting in Oslo in Norway, and I have been asked by the publisher if I could give you some kind of presentation of my book. And in these Corona times, we decided that we will do it in a slightly different way. And instead of you just listening to me, I asked a colleague, actually, Harald Løvik, if he could be so nice and whatever he want to ask me, right, instead of me just talking. So he will accepted that, and he will do that. So I think I'll just leave it to you, Harald.
I will start with this question, because you write a book, you self-publish, and you end up on the front page of Wall Street Journal. What happened?
Yeah, that was actually, I guess, 7 years ago or something. I had absolutely no plan of writing a book. But then I started to dig into ski waxing, and ski waxing is like a religion in Norway. In Norway, it works like this. If you cannot wax your skis, your wife's skis, you're not the man. That is how it works. And it's also some unwritten rules about ski waxing in Norway. And I'm talking ski waxing, like on the ski, really. If you're not on the national team, you are not really allowed to have an opinion about ski waxing in public. And in Norway, people can talk about ski waxing for hours. So it's really a big thing. It's a very strange thing, actually. It's like wine in France or barbecue in Argentina. We have ski waxing. So I ended up writing a book. Actually, I published it first on iTunes, and it just took off. It was the best-selling book in Norway on iTunes for a whole season. And then it was picked up by a publisher. And surprise, surprise, it became one of the bestsellers that years about ski waxing. And that was so strange for the Americans that they published it on the front page of Wall Street Journal. The Norwegians are just crazy about ski waxing, and I'm proud to be there, and was very much a surprise to me.
But then you make a jump from a book on ski waxing to a novel. How did that happen?
The good thing about writing a book is that you get invited to parties, right? And that's really, in the publishing industry, they have real parties. I actually work in the IT industry, and we don't have that kind of parties. So, but it's really fun in Norway with this publishing house when I have these parties. But I was, of course, nervous. I was not part of this. I didn't feel like a writer, right? I came a little bit embarrassed about the whole thing. And I took the elevator up and came out on this balcony where the party is happening in Gyldendal. And I saw a guy there, and he looked modest, right? He looked like he was a little bit shy. And I approached him, and I said, maybe he was a translator or something, I was thinking. And it turned out he was the head of the Gyldendal. And then he asked me, what are you? Why are you here? And I said, I'm an auditor, right? I've written a book about ski waxing. And then he had actually read my book. And I realized that everyone in the publishing house had read my book, at least almost. And then he said to me, you are writing so well. And that was a surprise to me, because until then, I have only thought about me and writing like it was all about ski waxing, but actually it was my language here, and he appreciated. And that night I went home to my wife and said, I'm going to write a novel. And she wasn't very happy about it, because I've been in the bubble waxing too long. So, but our marriage has survived it, so I guess it's okay in the end. So that then became this novel, which is the reason why I'm here. I wish I could pronounce it, but I will request some help from Google. Here comes.
Кубик Рубика и пятый Битл.
Rubiks kube og den femte Bitl in Norwegian.
Your friends know you as a kind of all-in type of person. If you get interested in something, you deep dive. You did in ski waxing, but why Beatles?
Yeah. I've always been a Beatles fan. From I was like the main character. There are some similarities between us, put it that way. And when some years ago, we had a meeting at work, and we were supposed to say something funny about ourselves, some interesting facts, fun facts. And John Dreisack, he was from Switzerland, and he said, I have drinking beers with the Beatles. And I was really starstruck, right? I mean, what is this? And I went back to him 5 years ago, and I said, you need to tell me more. Because Beatles actually has never been in Switzerland, at least not in the beginning of the 60s when he claimed to met them. And to make a long story short, I managed to dig up that they actually have been in Switzerland, based on what he was saying and based on facts I found other places in all newspapers and others. It's a Rose Festival, long story. But he actually had beer with the Beatles. And I think that is, that kind of was a starting point for me for this whole novel, right? What happened if someone is having a beer with the Beatles in the beginning of the 60s?
There's a lot of Beatles in there, but also a lot of elements from your own youth. Tell us where you grew up.
Yeah. I grew up in Norway in a small place called Fredrikstad. I think I can get the background. Let me see if this is working. Yeah, this is Fredrikstad. This is there's a river coming out in Fredrikstad. It's a very nice small town. There are beaches there, and the main character is traveling around first with a bicycle, and then he grew up with a moped, and in the end they have cars.
Could you give us a brief overview of the storyline?
Oh, I will try to do it without spoiling anything. So basically, the main character, Anders, he walks up one day, and he's a Beatles fan 20 years too late. And one day, John Lennon is shot. That's the first sentence in the book, actually. John Lennon is dead. He, for some strange reason, decided that he want to reunion Beatles, meaning that he will meet the 3 remaining Beatles members. So over the next 6 years, he traveled to England to meet with those 3 characters. But the book is not actually about that. It's about relationships. It's about the first love. It's about grief. It's really strong emotions in this book. In Norway, someone in the publisher in Norway, they said those are Russian emotions.
Okay.
It's really about development of this main character and his relationship with his friends, with his parents, and how he developed as a person as growing up.
I know you did a lot of research. As I pointed out earlier, you are kind of all in and with like details. Can you tell us about how you did that?
Yeah, I think the reality kind of makes it easier to write. So because then you don't have to make up what kind of weather it was, for example. So just used as an example, I know which day everything in the book is happening. And if I'm saying it's snow, it was snow that day. Yeah. So I spent 9 months digging into Beatles, and I investigated. I mean, the tours, the records, of course the music, their wives, the use of drugs, so that has influenced their music. Not that I'm writing about all that, but if you're going to write something where you have Beatles as a central part of a novel, you need to know what you're talking about. But again, that would make the story really boring if I would write about all that. So it's more something which is in the background, which you don't have to write about because I know it's what I'm writing is correct. Forget what I mean.
It's your second book, but a novel. To get it published, that was a walk in the park, I guess.
No, it was not. I mean, it's strange because I have written this non-fiction book, right, about ski vaccine, but it doesn't help you anything when it comes to a fiction book, which I did. And the strange thing is that I guess the first time I sent it into a publisher, I've been working on it for 2 years, and I had the full manuscript, and I sent it in. And I somehow expected them to come to me within a few days and say, wow, we need to come down here immediately. And then I heard nothing. And then I was waiting 2 months and finally got an email one evening. I was sitting in my couch and in my living room, and I was opening the email. And when I opened it, it basically said, yeah, it's a very good book, blah, blah, blah. However, we will not publish this. And I felt like I had been broken up with. I mean, it's real. I need to text my wife and say, please don't speak to me the next hours, right? Because I need to deal with this. But I was actually rejected 5 times before they said, okay, no, it's good enough. And I rewrote the whole thing 5 times, basically, before they picked it up. So I guess I had to start from scratch. That's how it is.
It's Corona times, Hans Olav. We are sitting in our homes and have been sitting for some weeks. But how is a writer's day in these Corona times? How do you do it?
So I don't read any news. I don't speak to anyone. I don't read newspapers because that will kill this gold hour of the day. So I always try to have 1 hour before I get any inputs from the outside, and that is the best hour for me to be creative. And that's also how I wrote this book. So,
how much can you write in an early morning hour?
Normally I write like 1 paragraph. But if you write 1 paragraph every day, in average, right, then it becomes a chapter after a while, right? Maybe it's 2 paragraphs one morning, and maybe you go back and rewrite 3 paragraphs. But yeah, maybe in 2 weeks you can write the chapter, maybe. Yeah. So, that's and then in the evening I can work a little bit more on the language. But it's in the morning I have to be creative before my brain is disturbed. Especially in Corona times, because if you open the news and you read about the Corona, all the people that are died the last 24 hours and the crisis, it's impossible to be creative.
Mm-hmm. I know you just ahead, or as the Corona started, you sat on the plane and went to Russia. Final question will be, what was your impression on this first visit?
I never been to Moscow before or Russia before, and I was invited by the publisher there. I went with my wife, and we had just 4 marvelous days in Moscow. It was a beautiful city. We had a guided tour. We saw the city, walked hours in the city. We saw the parks where you have all these buildings from the old Russian Soviet Union states. And then we met with a lot of people, from readers. And I don't know what I was expecting, but they were so open and curious and asking so many questions. And I found myself in discussions with them. It gave me a lot. I went home and I was thinking, wow, this is the best 4 days I had in years. I met with a lot of young people at the Nordic school, at the university one day, at the publisher. It was really 4 amazing days for both me and my wife. So I'll definitely go back.
Yeah. Should we close it there, Hans Olav?
Yes, let's do so. Thank you, and happy reading. Thank you, Harald.